Hello and welcome to the CNBC Africa special broadcast of Y20 South Africa. My name is Palesa Mufukeng, and this morning we bring you an insightful panel discussion on how do we bring young people to the forefront of economic transformation. Now, in a country hungry for inclusive growth and meaningful change, today we shine the spotlight on the voices, the ideas, and the leadership of young South Africans shaping the economy from the ground up. To our live audience that are joining us here, our viewers back at home, and of course, my lovely panelists, a very good morning to you all. Now, I do understand that it's still very early in the morning, and some of us, actually a lot of us at this time of the day, we haven't actually quite defrosted yet, as my peers would say, but I certainly do hope that you've had at least one cup of coffee to keep you going. Now, before we officially move on to the matters of the day, let's have a quick look at the scene setter.
The youth of South Africa are not just the leaders of tomorrow. They are the change makers of today. With over 60% of the population under the age of 35, South Africa's greatest asset is its young people. Their innovation, resilience, and energy are vital for driving inclusive economic growth, tackling unemployment, and shaping a future that is more equitable and sustainable. With South Africa hosting the G20 for the first time this year, it provides a historic opportunity to place African priorities at the center of the global agenda. Within this framework, the Youth 20 Engagement Group plays a pivotal role. As the official youth arm of the G20, Y20 provides a platform for young leaders to influence policy on pressing issues such as education, entrepreneurship, digital transformation, climate resilience, and economic inclusion. For South African youth, Y20 is more than a symbolic voice. It's a seat at the global table. Through Y20, young South Africans are working alongside peers from around the world to propose actionable recommendations that reflect local realities, from improving access to quality education and skilling programs to unlocking opportunities for youth-led enterprises and driving digital innovation in underserved communities.
Now, before we get into our conversation, allow me some time to officially introduce my panelists, three exceptionally bright young minds. To my immediate left, we have Mweketsi Kwahela, who's the co-chair of the Y20 South Africa. Now, what Mweketsi doesn't know is that the closer you are to me, the harder the questions will be. So, good luck to you. Just next to him, we have Anele Saja, who's the head of economic research and policy at the South African Youth Economic Council. And last but definitely not least, we have Obakeng Makapane, who's the curator for the Global Shapers at the Johannesburg Hub. Thank you all for joining us this morning and allowing us some time to pick your brains. Now, to officially start our conversation, I would like for each of you to articulate at least two things you believe are key to bringing young people to the forefront of economic transformation. And if I can just start with you, Mweketsi.
Yeah, so good morning, everyone. And of course, to the viewers who are watching and joining us online. I think for me, in terms of like bringing young people, to the forefront into the conversation is just create meaningful opportunities. Earlier on in the insert, you talked about, young people are desperately looking for opportunities. But also, I think for me, colleagues, what is important to note is that our young people literally are living right now in communities that are desperately hungry for electricity, water, and sanitation, right? So those are structural impediments. And for me, this country is nothing short of like social instruments, right? If you look at, for example, what the presidential, Yes, I think, right? What they're doing in terms of like the social instruments that they're putting out there, they are there, right? For me, oftentimes the question I'm always asking myself is that government is there and they're there in the party. But I think we need to meaningfully engage business, but also I think labor needs to come to the party as well, right? And essentially what I mean by that is that oftentimes whenever we disagree in this country in terms of the different sectors, we take to the streets. Nothing wrong with that. Protest is guaranteed in the Constitution. But I think for me, there needs to be a meaningful engagement across all sectors, whether we're in civil society, whether you're in business, or whether in government, to say what is going on. Because I think for me right now, we are literally at the edge of another July unrest, right, that we saw in 2021, right? So I think for me, those meaningful conversations about, okay, fine, young people are here, they're in the table. But what does it mean that you're now here in the table, right? What does a succession plan look like beyond getting the 5,000 Rand stipend, VIS, via this social instrument that government has put together? Because oftentimes those social instruments that are put together by government are temporary, right? Meaning that the corporate companies that are there, or those young people, wherever they're employed, it's for those institutions and organizations to take it forward, right? But oftentimes you find that the retention rate is far less than what it should be. Yeah.
So I think the two things that I would definitely say are necessary in terms of bringing young people into the forefront would be first to reconceptualize how we think about young people and the youth. I think oftentimes when we speak about young people, there's like a common phrase that says young people are the leaders of tomorrow. And even though that is true, I think there's a need to also acknowledge young people as the leaders of today. And by doing that, we make the voice of young people and I guess the resolutions that we come up with social imperatives, like this has to happen, as opposed to social suggestions that sometimes like, well, this is what young people think and we'll see if we can accommodate it. So the first, I think, is a reconceptualization of how we view young people as being leaders of today. And I think that brings me to my second point, right? If we think of young people as leaders of today, then we start to think about how we can integrate them meaningfully into all systems of the economy. The youth problem is not a silo. It doesn't function alone. I think the youth problem is a byproduct of many structural issues, right, across our productive sectors and our social sectors. So a second, I guess, frontier of bringing young people to the forefront is then thinking about how we integrate the youth problem and the youth struggle into social policy, into industrial policy, into, policy that has to do with social welfare and development and equity. And the reason for that is because when you start to think about solving the problem holistically, then you embed the youth in those systems, right? You don't make the youth, the possibility for change for young people as a byproduct of these systems. So you think about how young people can gain from industrial policy, and you create those policies to benefit young people. And I think those are the two main things that are very necessary to start to make young people play a bigger role in their contribution, but also then sustain that role over time, because the young people today are not going to be young forever, right? So we don't want to think about how young people can engage today. We want to think about systematically programming youth engagement and involvement in these structures over time.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Balisa. Just to echo my fellow panelists' sentiment here, I think the two things I would like to highlight is probably inclusion. We're all sitting in a room here. We probably speak the same way. We probably understand the same ideas, but we're not a reflection of the entire youth of South Africa. So when it comes to inclusion, it's important for us to look at where are we creating these spaces? How are we creating them? Are we including a child who doesn't speak like us, who doesn't have the same background as us? Because if we're not inclusive, then our solutions are not going to be inclusive. They're just going to be for the people who are able to speak for themselves and are able to stand up for themselves. So I think inclusion is one of the most important things. Then secondly, it's education. Our education system is probably one thing that keeps me up at night. And that's because I don't think it's helping us help young people function in the current system or the way the world is currently moving. So by that, I mean that we're not skilling them up with the necessary skills that they need in order to make the change that we want them to make, in order for them to be the leaders that we want them to be. So I think education is a very important one. So even when we speak about sustainability, how do we scale it down, or how do we speak to young people in a way that they understand what sustainability is? Doesn't matter if you are from Limpopo, Eastern Cape, Free State, Western Cape. Let's find a language that includes them, but also is able to educate them about their future and where we currently are.
Yeah. And I know we talk a lot about upscaling young people's participation and bringing them to the forefront of economic participation. But maybe let me personalize the question a little bit and ask, how does being an active participant as a young person look like in your individual spaces? And if I can start with you, Obageng.
So I'll speak on Global Shapers. So for those who don't know, Global Shapers is a World Economic Forum initiative for young people under the age of 30. So we are a group of young people who are trying to make a change in the community. So for example, with us, it's Johannesburg. We also have the Tshwane Hub, the Soweto Hub. So what we then do, a project that was very close to my heart, we went into Tembisa and we were educating kids on the differences between a career and a job and what the opportunities are for them. And the reason we did that is because we understand how limited the resources are in the townships, in rural areas, right? And what we're trying to make them see is there is a world beyond their local community that they can look out for. For the longest time, these kids have been told that science and maths are the way to go. Go and study science. If you're not good at science, then sorry, but there's nothing out there for you. But we're trying to kind of help them rethink their future and how the world is moving and how they can find their space. You don't have to go to a traditional university. So finding ourselves at grassroots level activity, we're able to also answer to them in a language that they understand, and also reach out for the problems that they currently face with. Because we could be sitting here and saying, oh no, young people don't have funding. You go out there and they're like, no, I actually don't understand what building a business actually means. So going out there and understanding their problems and trying to solve for their problems helps us better than us sitting here and then just speaking about them as if they are like far away idea.
And you, NLA?
So, as you mentioned, I sit as the head of economic policy and research at SAIC, the South African Youth Economic Council. And the work that we do really has to do with integrating young people and advocating for their involvement, meaningful involvement in the productive and social spheres of the economy, right? So part of that work has to do with creating spaces where young people can sit and build their networks through different, avenues. We bring together private sector, public sector, as well as academia, right? And those three kind of pillars become very important for the integration of young people. One, because we want to cover the knowledge base, right? We want young people to have access to information, knowledge, and build networks in the academic space. We also want young people to be able to have the reach to the private sector, as well as the public sector to, get the financing, to mobilize some of their ideas. And then you also want them to have recognition of how things actually function in those spaces, right? What are the systems? How do you go about doing, putting together your enterprise, or how you go about putting together your ideas in that space such that you can share them meaningfully, create that impact, and then also start to scale up the work that they do. So part of our work is then to also advocate and lobby for some of the social changes in policy. So our advocacy work has to do with speaking to policy recommendations, speaking to amendments, public commentary, dialogues that have to do with that. So many of the things that we're trying to embrace, say, if an upstream development petroleum act comes out, so it actually came out for commentary, I think, a month ago, right? How do we look at that document? How do we give an appraisal that says there are gaps here? There are no incentives for industrialists to work with youth-owned enterprises. We need to start putting those things in. Similarly, if we sit with the policy of the national minimum wage, we sit with questions of actually how much does it cost for a young person to live in South Africa? What are the needs of young people? Is this threshold even enough? And if it's not enough, how do we advocate for increasing that? And the reason why we do that is because we're realizing that the issues of the youth are becoming more and more pervasive, right? So we're not just sitting with unemployment now that's at 40-point-something%. You're sitting with the case of also underemployment, where people that are employed are not working enough. There's the issue of precarity in employment for young people. Similarly, there's now long-term unemployment, where I think 75% or 70% of young people are finding themselves in a consistent cycle of long-term unemployment. So understanding that our issues now as young people are growing exponentially, how do we then go about saying, where do we put the gaps? Where do we make the stops, right? So that systematically over time, jobs can create an escape from poverty, not just the day-to-day hand-in-mouth kind of system that we're seeing. So that's some of the work that we do.
If I can come to you, Weketsi, understanding that you serve, or rather you are the official engagement group for young people under the G20. If you can just give us a lay of the land, what are your plans as the Y20 this year? Some of our panelists spoke about inclusion, spoke about access. And how do you plan to make those outcomes stick?
Yeah. So, colleagues, for us, when we learned that, the G20 is coming to South Africa, and that, South Africa, has basically come together under the themes of, solidarity, equality, and sustainability, we said we are going to be young people who are going to build bridges, right? We are going to unite for solidarity. We're going to champion equality, but also we're going to drive sustainability, right? And really much of our work is currently taken through 5 thematic tracks. That is climate change and environmental sustainability, number 1, right? So what are those green horizons? And I think some of my colleagues talk about it. What does it mean when we say we are leading a just energy transition? Number 2, we are looking at inclusive economic growth and fighting inequality, right? And then the third one, we're looking at, digital, AI, education, and the future of work. What are those key competency skills that our young people need to be equipped with to set them up for success? And the fourth one is what does it mean to really meaningfully engage young people? But also, how do we reform these multilateral organizations like your AU, your UN, that young people really want to participate in, right? And the last one really is just about inclusive social development and fighting inequality. And we're very committed to saying, We want to leave no one behind. And essentially much of our work is basically right now for, the past month, our young people have been in formal negotiations with their international counterparts, right? Some of our delegates are here and the co-chairs of those thematic tracks. And essentially they've been negotiating with some of the other member countries of the G20. And last week, in fact, we held our pre-summit, right? Which was sort of like a closed-off session where, again, we are not only negotiating, but deliberating on all these five key thematic tracks as China, this is what we are saying on climate change. As South Africa, we disagree and saying no, but we should, in fact, prioritize, debt for climate swaps, for example, right? As Argentina, this is what we're arguing for. And much of, and with regards to the second question around how we're going to make sure that it sticks, firstly, we have 3 high-level deliverables. Number one, we really want to, establish a Sherpas Council, but also a Y20 Alumni Association. And the reason why is that we are the oldest engagement group in the G20. 14 years of existence, right? Since 10 years. So Y20 started in Canada in 2010, right? Mm-hmm. We've got plus minus 200 recommendations. None of them have been implemented. And essentially, today, after I leave here, I need to go to Sun City for the 3rd Sherpas meeting, which is taking place right now. And that is where essentially we're going to lobby to make sure that the Y20 and all our recommendations across the 5 thematic tracks, our one-pager is there to say that we are young people and we are serious about resolving for not only this country, but also the globe.
Understanding that one of the key things for the G20 this year, as you have mentioned, is equality, which I believe speaks to inclusion, right? How are you ensuring that you are including those that are beyond your elite circles? And I'm talking about those that are sitting in the townships, those that are in the rural areas. Yeah. How do we ensure that not only do they have a voice on the table, but they can also see the outcomes that will work specifically for them? Yeah.
I'm happy you raised that question because, so when we started with the Y20, after we organized ourselves and we mobilized ourselves, but also we conscientized ourselves, one of the first things that we did was to put an expression of interest, right? To say, Y20 is here. Young people of South Africa, it's time to rise, right? But also young people of the African Union, because I think it is also important, colleagues, to note that, this is also seen to be, Africa's G20, given that the African Union is part of now, officially one of the member states of the G20. So essentially, we put that expression of interest form. Young people applied in numbers. All of them have been accepted. And there was a reason why, right? Because oftentimes the Y20, especially with our engagement group, it was an exclusive space, right? Only for the elite, where if I'm in the space of international relations, diplomacy, I would be taken as a delegate and so on. We said, no, we're done with that this year. We want to open it up. And essentially part of our inclusion has also looked like partnering up with SIA, the South African Institute of International Affairs, but also the G20 Education Working Group, where we are doing Y20 G20 roadshows. So far, we've been to Mpumalanga. Last week, I was in Kimberley, Salt Lake University. We've been to Northwest, both the campuses, right? But also we've been to Venda as well, Univen. And essentially, we're just choosing universities as venue sites, right? So all those engagements are open to young people who also live in the periphery, in the urban. Transport has been organized for them to say, this is your time, right? Come in and make your inputs, right? But also part of our provincial roadshows is also partnering up with local organizations, people who are legit on the ground doing grassroots work to say, whether that young person in rural Eastern Cape or KZN doesn't know about the G20, it's our business as the Youth 20, which is the youth engagement group of the G20, to make sure that they know about the G20, right? Forget the language, forget the international relations language, the diplomacy language. What is going on in your mining community? What is going on in your informal, settlements, right? So that is how we've really made sure that we fostered, inclusion, but also through our working groups as well. Okay. So whilst the international process is to have the South African delegates and the track co-chairs leading those negotiations, the working groups is also a South African-led process to make sure that across all those 5 key thematic tracks that are highlighted, right, young people can come back and the delegates can actually come back to those working groups and pressure test what's been coming out of their formal negotiations. Yeah.
And then let me come to you. I do understand that part of the work that you do is around advocacy and policy recommendation to public and private sector players at decision level making. What practical actions are you recommending to these stakeholders to address some of the issues that you've all talking about?
Sure. So I think I'm going to start with 2 aspirational ones for like the Y20. Obviously not this year because this is already in motion, but I think we can start to lay the foundation for some of this kind of thinking, right, through what's happening already. The first, I think, aspirationally, we want there to be a formal integration of Y20 recommendations, as you've mentioned, 14 years, over 200 recommendations. We haven't seen operationalizing or implementation of some of these, right? And I think a very big outcome of the Y20 should be some kind of embedding of these recommendations in national policies, right? So outside of just the delegates, I guess, negotiating amongst themselves, it also needs to come a strategy from the Y20 to say, as the representatives of youth from all of these different, states, how are we thinking about making sure that in the next budget cycle, some of these recommendations are considered? Because I think that would be a very powerful thing to know, for example, that next year, end of the financial year, a consideration of our annual fiscus is that there were recommendations that came out of the Y20, and these are things that we must factor in the budget. So from a policy level, that's something that's aspirational. I think that should come up from the Y20. Similarly, just the establishment of, of capital resourcing, right? When we think of the Y20, it's a huge structure that can come up with something like a legacy fund for youth-led initiatives at a multilateral level, which is something big, something innovative, and something that engagement group has the power to do. So as I said, we're already in motion this year, and I think some of the key pillars that my colleague mentioned here are fantastic as they are. Some of these kind of policy embedding and recommendations can start to form the foundation of that work and be carried through. But in general, some of the policy kind of initiatives that we've put forward, we try and look at, as SAIC, we try and look at some of the key gaps in the policies that exist, particularly because the creation of new policies is something that I want to say is a bit of a disease for our state. So many policies, there's policies that are overlapping, there's policies for policies, there's strategies for policies, and we want to get to a point where we say, how do we harmonize all of these things, right? So if there's a youth policy, and then there's a policy for, let's say, a young industrialist fund, there's also a transformation fund that's coming about. How do we take the structures that exist around, for example, to say, this transformation fund that's meant to come up with 100 billion over 5 years, how do we earmark some of the funds to be safeguarded, let's say, by the National Youth Development Agency for youth-led initiatives that we can create a young emerging Black industrialist group. So some of the work that we do in terms of advocating for policy, both in the private and public sector, is to make those stakeholders comfortable. Let's not come up with something that is going to rattle the room, even though we do, and I think we have the space to, because we're young and we're revolutionary in that way. But in terms of trying to meet them halfway, right? These are the policies that exist. There's a youth tax incentive for a threshold of hiring young people. Do we increase that? Do we decrease that? And if we increase that, what is going to be the outcome of subsidizing industrialists to employ young people? So those are the kind of things that we were looking at. We're trying to be very technical and methodological about how we go about it, because we want all of these stakeholders to buy into what already exists, and then from there we can start to push them a bit. And I think we have.
Yeah, which is important. And it's all good and well to hear about all of these policies and great plans that are going to be implemented, but I think it's important that we take a step back and appreciate the fact that there's a difference between intention and execution. Is there a way of tracking that these policy directives that you are making to these decision level makers are being implemented?
So part of, I want to say how we work, right, is that we will produce, I think, an amendment document of whatever policy, whatever strategy that we're dealing with, and then we'll also present a framework of how we want to monitor and evaluate this. And oftentimes what we try and embed there is some kind of system to create a council that's going to review, to review whether or not the strategy is even working. So there's a pilot phase intervention to say, is this going to work in this way, and are we going to get these outcomes? Then secondly, there's an imperative to say, if we are calling for, a policy lever to be introduced in a particular way, how is it that we're going to create a check and balance for stakeholders to buy into it, but also to make sure that we hold them accountable to buying into it? So if we're saying we're going to give you an incentive for employing young people, then we need to know that we have a system that's going to track how many people you've employed, what's your retention rate of those people, and how do you integrate them outside of just this one role, right? And after that, then there's also a framework to monitor and evaluate the system in its entirety. So then there's a plan to say, after a threshold, or let's say a medium term, 3 to 5 years, have we then gotten the outputs that we suggested here? So if we said we're going to increase jobs by a margin of, let's say, 8 to 10%, what's the percentage we're sitting on? And if it's not looking like 8 to 10, then it means either there's a gap between what we're suggesting, or perhaps the system at play, as you're saying, implementation-wise, have to be strengthened, and then we go from there.
I want to bring in a global perspective, and I believe, again, this is where you come in through your Global Shapers community. Just from a global standpoint, what trends are you seeing around how young people in other developing markets are responding to economic exclusion, and what lessons can South Africa take from there?
Thank you so much, Valesa. I think a lot of young people are starting to go into entrepreneurship, and I understand why. We as young people have a lot of ideas, and the way of work has changed quite a lot. The way we see the world, the solutions that we bring forward are quite different to what the traditional marketplace or workplace has kind of set out for us. So we're seeing a lot of people going into entrepreneurship, specifically in the technological space. We're seeing a lot of people go into agriculture. And what's fascinating is that on the African continent, with all these technological changes that are happening, young people are not just adopting the Western way of using technology. They're actually looking at how can we use our own problems to solve. How can we use our technology to solve for our own problems? So I'll give you an example. In Kenya, Kenya, Nigeria, and I think Ghana, they have quite an increased level of startups in the fintech space, because they realize that financial inclusion means that everyone has to have access. We need to be able to transact in a way that my grandmother in the rural area is able to get the money almost instantly. And because their banking system has not always accommodated for that, they then came up with those solutions. And I think that is also a challenge for other African countries to look at that and say, how can we support young people in solving for the problems that they face with today? And it doesn't have to be the most drastic change that we see or the biggest idea. It doesn't have to be that, right? It has to be, where am I right now? What is the current problem I'm faced with? And how can I then use technology to solve for that? And you don't have to learn the AI tools, right? There are other ways you can do it. There's no code, where you don't have to learn the language, but rather use the technology without the educational background. So it's a lot of young people going into entrepreneurship. However, that the partnership that you spoke about now, the public and the private sector partnership plays a big role in how they can then scale their businesses and further their impact. So I think that is also important, where government comes in, the education sector comes in, and the private sector comes in without trying to overtake those ideas, because we see that happen as well. So, yeah.
Yeah. And just from your view inside the private sector, do you think corporate South Africa is doing enough to support young people, especially as you say, that are going into entrepreneurship in terms of funding, providing access to funding, or are we still just ticking the boxes here?
So I am actually an economist by profession. I do work in the private sector. And what I've seen is, like Anila pointed out, we find that corporate will absorb young people, but then they will upskill them with what they currently need in their corporate space. And when that person is done with their 12-month internship, they then cannot be absorbed in other places because they don't have the skills that they need for them to then go work for a different company. So corporate South Africa has this weird way of moving around how they skill young people. And I think if they had a policy in place to say, you're not going to teach this person how to just do HR work. You need to skill them so that when they do leave your 12-month internship, they then absorbed into a more permanent position. That is a challenge for corporate South Africa. When it comes to the funding parts, there are so many loopholes for young people and young entrepreneurs before they get the funding. And sometimes they're not educated enough, or they're not given the necessary resources for them to then apply for that funding. So you'll find that corporate will come to us and say, but there is funding. There's so much funding for young people. But do the young people, are they able to access that funding? Do they know how to fill out all those forms and submit? Because that is a costly exercise. How do we make sure that we support them so that they can then access that funding? Do they know the language that you're using in corporate for them to then get that funding as well? Because if you want to meet them where they are, you need to also understand their language. So corporate South Africa needs to try and bridge that gap. And it comes from that intergenerational gap that we see. We need to work together with the older people as young people, but they also need to understand where we're coming from. And I think that conversation, I see it happening with the G20, but we need to continuously foster it beyond the Y20, beyond the G20.
Amazing. Thank you. Thank you for these insights. I want to share some statistics with you, and I'll go back to the point that you made earlier around education. Now, according to the African Development Bank, the continent produces roughly about 13 million graduates per year, but there are only 3 jobs that have been made. So then obviously the question then becomes, what happens to the 10 million? They'll probably be forced into the informal sector, the hustle culture, or like you say, entrepreneurship. And
Mokitz, I want to come to you because I do understand that you're also an educator. When we think about sustainability versus survival, how can we bridge this gap between what is taught in the classroom and what the rapidly evolving world of work, as we've seen, actually requires?
I think maybe let me answer that by and carry the thinking from Obakeng that we need a new language. I think we need a new social contract in this country. And I'm serious about that. Because I think for me, I mean, there are movements in this country. And these are civil society organizations who are doing movement work, like your equal education, right? That are, advocating for minimum standards, norms and standards in terms of infrastructure, but also the ways in which is the curriculum actually setting up our young people up for such. It's not, right? And we do know that in this country, we have, two education systems, the private sector and the public schooling system, right? So I think for me, we need a new language because colleagues, I always raise this and I think people think I'm being dramatical, but honestly, I think I must also raise it here. In 2011, in 2011, right? In Tunisia, Palisa, a young person set themselves on fire. His name was Mohamed Bouazizi. Set himself on fire because the police came up to him to say he was selling vegetables, right? And you don't have license to trade. And that young man, his death sparked what we've now are studying as the Arab Spring. Egypt, Libya, Syria, and we know what happened there. We like to pretend, especially in this country, because I think sometimes we believe in South African exceptionalism. Nothing wrong with that. But we know what's happening, colleagues, in Mozambique. We know what's been happening in Kenya, Eswatini, Zimbabwe, right? Nigeria, and bad governance. And we know what's happening, right? If we do not come together and develop a new language to say business, right? There's B20, business 20, corporate companies that are here. How are you working with B20, with Kes Kovadia and Boos Putimahanyele and them to say, guys, we need a new language in this country? Because I think we are at the precipice. And especially, plus minus 2 weeks ago, Stats SA released the quarter labor survey. Again, young people, the largest demographic, are the ones who are making noise in those statistics, right? Perhaps the national dialogue is that space. The president announced it on 16 June. What is going to be our entry point to the national dialogue? All of us who are seated here, whether you're in civil society, whether you're in corporate, whether you're in business, whether you're in academia, right? So I think for me, we need a new language as part of bridging the divide that you highlighted. Because if we don't, then we're going to continue and speak in silos and all those things. But I am telling you, those silos one day, but I don't want to be an alarmist there. I don't want to be like, hey, no. But yeah.
No, thank you for sharing. Thank you for sharing, Wikiti. You talk a lot about that we need a new language. What is that language?
I think it's a language of inclusivity, collaboration, but also sustainability, right? And essentially is, Obakeng talked about she's doing work with young people in Tembisa, right? Anele is doing work with young people in mining communities who might also be interested in doing mining to say, but how do we also, benefit from our own minerals? Part of my work as an, education and training officer, we run youth clubs within the Gauteng area, in the 5 Gauteng regions, Tshwane, Sedibeng, Ekurhuleni, West Rand, and Johannesburg, right? Young people there are already highlighting their issues that as a young person who lives in the inner city of Johannesburg, my top key 3 issues are potholes, electricity, water, sanitation, and. These are the solutions that I am proposing, right? Government, create that enabling environment in terms of policy, right? Because already when you look at, the local government on the white paper, right now it's in review in terms of our municipalities to say, okay, fine, as the city of Johannesburg, how should we engage with you as citizens? Because our constitution already provides for participation. In 1994, that is one of the first things we made sure of, that ours is going to be a participatory democracy. But oftentimes also we sometimes as citizens, we sit back and we don't participate. How many of us actually here know what's your ward councillor? Like, who's your ward councillor? Or what is your municipal ward? Right now, the city of Johannesburg is going through the demarcation of ward. Are you part of those consultative meetings? Right? But we are fighting in WhatsApp groups. In WhatsApp groups, we are there. But we're not out. We're not attending the integrated development planning meetings. We're not. We're not attending our IDP meetings where decisions are being made on our behalf. Right? The powers that be are going. IDP meetings, colleagues, are there to serve us, we, the people. Because out of the issues that you highlight, you say, no, I live in Kilani, I live in Sandown, I live in Melville, I live in Soweto, I live in this, right? These are the issues. We need recreation in this community. We need a library. We need this. Out of that, they create a budget that will then feed on, right? And then an accountability mechanism then comes in to say, but you said you're going to deliver on this. Where are you with that? I think we think our job is done after we voted last year. It's not, right? Local government elections are coming up. Right. And that is why we as young people of Y20, we are using platforms like the Third Shepherd's meeting, right, to lobby, because we understand that we also need to lobby other engagement groups to say Ocean 20, Business 20, Civil Society 20, Startup 20, that is speaking to entrepreneurs and the township economy. How are you including young people in your final recommendations? Because let me tell you this, colleagues. Part of the reason why we're also doing this lobbying work as Y20 and attending all these meetings is because we understand that when our things are then put in that leaders' declaration, then it opens up finance. Change is slow, especially with multilateralism, I can tell you that. But you then see, gangani, bit by bit, these things coming in the UN and all those things, right? So for us, again, what is our new social contract, right?
Spoken like a true educator there. Anil, I'm going to put you on the spot here because you did mention that you're an economist, or was it overgang? But you're also an economist as well. What data is currently driving your thinking around accelerating young people's participation in the economy? Is it the unemployment stats? Is it the scale of AI integration? Is it climate change, or something completely different?
Sure. So I'm going to start with a question, then after that I'm going to caveat into one of the pillars of these languages that my colleague spoke about. So in terms of the key statistics and data that we're looking at, one, I definitely think the unemployment problem is one that sticks out like a sore thumb. You can't ignore it even if you wanted to. That's the first big thing. And as I mentioned earlier, there's pervasive elements of this unemployment. So now you're also seeing underemployment. You're also seeing a spatial kind of spread of different kinds of unemployment where consequently, there's a double burden of exclusion, let's say in people in rural areas or areas in the periphery, right? We think of the township economy and you start to see that the statistics are looking as though this township economy consistently leaves those people in the outskirts in that outskirt and reserve economy. So those are some of the key statistics and data points that we're looking at. What's happening with unemployment, what's happening with underemployment, and what's happening with the spatial divide in terms of those that are in the labor market to those that are not. Another thing that we're definitely looking at is the statistics for I want to say businesses, small businesses, and entrepreneurship. When you think of SMMEs, right, in characteristically developing countries have a huge base of SMMEs. One, because oftentimes people are forced into that kind of entrepreneurship, but also because it tends to then absorb that youth energy and need for economic participation. Now, the crisis that we're seeing is in South Africa, at least, right? Over 75% of SMMEs form part of our employers. But we're not supporting SMMEs, and we're not supporting them in a way where they can scale that employment that they give to our economy. So some of the key statistics we're looking at is to say, if we have SMMEs that form such a huge employer base, how do we then support them to scale up their employment capacity? We're also looking at the number of businesses that are owned by young people, right? Those statistics tend to give us an idea of the future for employment for young people. Young businesses tend to employ young people. So we're making those links statistically to say, if we have a threshold of young businesses and entrepreneurs, right, how do we increase that such that they will employ at whatever margin more young people? We're also looking at, as you mentioned, some of climate finance and climate, I think, statistics. We're sitting in a huge position where we're trying to balance the just transition with our endowments as a country, and also then balance that with the future, right? So we want to build capacities. The statistics are saying to us that our national commitments, right, need a particular threshold of production of some of our national endowments. How do we balance that and create a trade-off where we're both adhering to the just transition as we should and as we've committed to, but also not throwing away the potential for some of our national endowments to grow the economy in ways that are also beneficial for a particular youth demographic. And then lastly, as I said, I just wanted to circle back to one of the key points of the language that the change in this language that my colleague was speaking about. I think one thing that we should add to that list is equal leadership. Young people must be seen as equal leaders to the powers that be, such that that collaboration that Moketsi was speaking about starts to shift the voice of young leaders from just making, I guess, resolutions that speak to young people to actually making decisions. The young leaders need to be the decision makers for young people. That is the kind of system that we want to create, such that we don't have youth kind of cohorts and youth organizations and engagement groups that speak on behalf of the youth, but are not actioning on behalf of the youth. There's a need to give power to operational and implementation capacity to young people in that way.
Sure. My director is telling me that only 5 minutes. I wish I could hold you all to myself. I know time moves so fast, but I would like to open the floor for questions. But before I do that, and perhaps as a parting shot from you all, if you could reimagine one public policy today to fast-track economic participation, what would it be and why? And I'll start with you, Obakeng.
Jeez, you said the person who's closer to you gets the hardest question. If I were to reimagine one public policy, it would definitely be around entrepreneurship. And I'll tell you why. I have done a lot of reading in my academic space about what entrepreneurship can do for a country. And when you change the barriers to entry when it comes to different sectors, what can happen? Right now, we are speaking about energy transition. There are people say, oh my goodness, there are a lot of opportunities around energy transition. But what are the barriers for someone who wants to now start a solar system business? If we remove those barriers to entry, do we not increase the competition? Do we then not regulate the prices? Do we then not avoid the whole energy transition is only for people who can afford energy transition? If it is such an important thing for the rest of the world, why should it be only covered by people who can afford it? So I think entrepreneurship and removing those barriers to entry will be very important for us to see more small businesses come into the space, more young people come into the space, but also give them the confidence to say, this is your space. You guys can own it and you can build it however way you want it for the future that you want to see in this country.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Anele?
Again, mine might be a bit aspirational, but I'm going to start from what already exists. I think one of the most important national policies and public policies that we need to start to think about is that of capital ownership. I think right now as it stands, we have policies that speak to how to either scale it up, how to perhaps protect it, and in some elements, how to make it a bit more equitable, right? Think of your BEs, think of your affirmative action and things like that. But there's a need to create a bit more robustness about that. And when I say robustness, I mean to say there's a need to think about how capital ownership must be spelled out. That we need to create a base of capital ownership where young people are included. The percentage, what's that? We need to create a base of capital ownership where women are included. What's the percentage? We need to create a basis of capital ownership where Black people are included and have particular numbers attached to that. And the reason why I say that is because these demographics that I've just spoken about, right? Young people, Black women, I might even take it a step further and say those that are in the rural areas and outskirts of township. You're facing a quadruple burden of disadvantage here. You're starting on a back foot where you're facing many incidences of exclusion that are layered and they're intersecting. Capital ownership and the ability to own the means of production in some way, right, is one of the key ways that you start to undo the generational impact of that intersecting disadvantage, that intersecting exclusion. And I think when we start to put imperatives on policies that have to do with capital ownership at a national level, at industry level, at sector level, we're going to start to see the changes that are going to see these demographics that are marginalized in this particular way grow out of a particular state dependency, but then also start to create a base of individuals that can, over generations, escape cycles of poverty, which our current system of capital ownership doesn't allow for. So yes, you have your job, but it's a hand-in-mouth situation, as you were describing with Moketsi, right? How do we create a system over time that allows you, through maybe your employment, to say, how do capitalists or industrialists then start to give their employees stakes and shares and equity in some of the companies that they work in? And having that means of production, some form of capital in different forms, is going to form the basis of a productive and included, but also then empowered economy for young people and those people that fall part of that marginalized demographic.
Sure. Your thoughts, Moketsi?
For me, it would have to be the national youth policy, right? How many of us actually know that there's a national youth policy in this country, right? That is similar to the National Development Plan. How many of us, particularly as young people, are actually engaging with that national youth policy to make sure that all those things that have been, outlined in that policy are not only implemented, we are able to track them, but what needs updating, right? For me, it doesn't make sense to live in a country that does not it can't imagine or can't think, how do we move our people from childhood dependency into full adulthood independency? Even the social instruments we try to come up with, they don't work, because we fully cannot imagine what it means to move from, you're a child and now you're a full adult and you're actually working, you're earning an income, you're able to provide or make meaningful contributions to the economy, right? And that is why oftentimes we, as young people who fall under that youth bracket of 15 to 34, we fight ourselves fighting on social media and all these other platforms with youth and dad. And part of that is because also we haven't begun to imagine, okay, fine, after Moketsi is now 35, is no longer a youth, and is now, according to our terms, like an adult, probably married, has kids and all those things, but what is Moketsi now doing, right? We need to meaningfully, like, in our country, right? We need to say, children will do this. This is how they'll transition into adulthood. Now they're, proper adults, right? I know the brain forms at 25, but, now you're 35. This is your plan between, 35 and 80 up until you retire. Look at the Asian tigers and what they've done. They've stuck to their plans. Singapore many years ago was similar to us. Yeah, they pivoted there and there, but the Asian tigers stuck to their plans, right? Why can't we stick to ours, right? And again, I circle back and connect to perhaps this national dialogue that's been announced, that's where this national compact, the new national compact, is going to be committed to. Perhaps we can go there in our numbers and say, we are here, we are raising our hands, and we are ready to work.
Yeah.
So let's get to work.
Yeah. I'm officially going to open up the floor now for questions from our audience. Do you believe there is a mic that's floating around? Please tell us who you are and what your question is and who it is posed to.
Sanbonani, my name is Dudu Makari. I'm going to put on my social entrepreneurship hat and advocate for inclusion. I think, Obakeng, you spoke about inclusion. So I work in a village called Mutlabe. There are 107 villages in the Moses Kotana local municipality. And I've marveled at how they've managed to organize themselves in terms of, we've got a young forum for unemployed youth, we've got a business forum. But because we're 90 kilometers from Rustenburg, and it cost me 62 rands to get from one place to another, the idea, everything that you've spoken here, I'm feeling like I'm not sure how these young people are actually going to access anything that's been spoken here today. So my advocacy is really around, how do we take all these initiatives to those young people? We've got an extremely robust system from an IEC perspective, where every ward has a voting station, so we know where people are. But how are we taking these Y20 conversations? How is the NYDA getting to Motlabe, which is 180 odd kilometers from Johannesburg. I do that work because I'm passionate about young people in those spaces and giving them a sense of personal agency. But how do we take all these opportunities there? Because now for me to ask them for 62 Rand one way, they're not working. So how are they going to actually get there? English, why is it a kumsha today? But when I get to Motlabe, Stwana Saka must flex, Sanseki Dumedi and I must find the language in Y20. It cannot. So how do we then, just from a languaging perspective, how do we bring young people to those, how do we bring these opportunities to those environments? And my last point is around education. Both high school and the primary school serve 32 villages. All of them get bussed into the one primary school and the one high school. Both those institutions do not have access to digital technology. I heard you say something around AI and guys, they don't. I opened a laptop the other day and they asked me what that was. And we're in 2025. And these are young people who don't use this as a form of technology or access from an education perspective. So our issues are layered and they kind of just need intimate conversations, intimate intervention to say, in this village, go Motlabe, 100 and however odd kilometers away from Johannesburg. There's 107 other villages that look exactly like that. How do we get to them? So as we think about new languaging, inclusion, can we please think about those things? Awesome. Thank you.
Any takers? Was your question targeted at a specific person? Who's your question?
Oh, no, I think it was more of a comment.
Okay.
And just some inputs around inclusion, language. Take this thing to them. Don't expect them to come to you.
Yeah. So I think maybe I'll take the education aspect specifically around digital innovation and all those things. But also I'm going to implore the colleagues who are in attendance. So we have here our South African delegates and the co-chairs for each of the 5 thematic tracks that I spoke with. And they're here to engage on that. We have Hlengile Mthethwa, who's leading our AI, digital innovation, education, and future of work. Andile Mnguni, who's doing climate change and environmental sustainability, right? Negotiating on the South African position on that. Lerai Rakoditswe and also Siposihle Bongani, who are in the multilateral and reforming multilateral organizations. But I've also seen Otsile Shuma, who's also in inclusive social economic growth. So I'm going to request that after we're done here, you engage with them, who will also be able to take those inputs to assist us as Y20 to specifically speak to your questions around how do we get there, but also in terms of how do we get there. We've already started with our Y20 workshops, road shows rather, right? And they also take the form of workshops. And like I said earlier on, so far we've been to Mpumalanga, Northwest, we were in Kimberley last week, Northern Cape, Izolo, we're actually in KZN. Yeah, now I'm speaking Zulu. But yeah, we are making sure that we go to each and every province and we are partnering up with people like yourselves who are local partners. And it would be great to speak after here and even the ones who are here so that we can get in contact so that if you are in a particular province, we then are able to engage with you because again, we don't come in as experts, right? We come in as we are very much willing to learn and here to listen to you. If anything, you are the experts because you live in those communities and are better acclimatized to the lived experiences there. Yeah.
Okay, I noted your hand.
Just a very quick comment. Did you say Sis Kukune? Dudu. Sis Dudu, you being here firstly is a very big step already to represent the community that you come from. Earlier on, I mentioned that Global Shapers, we do work in Tembisa. I'm actually from Tembisa. I saw the gap when I was I think I was around 16 years old. And I always made sure that whatever I do, I bring it back to the people who I know I would have benefited from. So I think you just being here today already opens up the room and opens up the conversation for them. And representation always matters. So whatever space you find yourself in, make sure that you pull the next person in. Yes, we might be sitting here, we might be speaking like this, but I am from Kokazi. So I know that when I get there, I need to speak that language. I'm not going to be there like, oh yeah, AI, generative AI. That's not the language they understand, you know. But it's important for them to also see representation. It's also important for Wanako Tembisa to see Obageng sitting here and say, I can do it. I have access as well.
Yes, Anile.
Yeah, I just wanted maybe to engage with some of the points in the commentary that Sis Dudu gave us. I think when you look at the IEC, the IEC framework of how they've gone out and managed to make themselves accessible is something that we need to think about replicating for different structures across the place. When you think of the IEC, they've made very, very good use of social public infrastructure. If there's a church, you'll vote at the church. If there's a school, you'll vote at the school. That's what we need to start to think about, making more robust for different structures, right? Across all these sectors. If there's a road show, a skills symposium, a SIAC event, some of the things that we do in terms of our campaign work, we are trying to really think about galvanizing the social infrastructure that already exists, right? So whether or not you want to take your event for young people to a hotel, sometimes take it at the church, because that's where you'll meet the people that need it the most, right? So I think that there's that kind of modeling and framework that we need to start to think about replicating in different spheres. And then I also want to say, along with that, right, we then need to think about how we capacitate these very places that we go to. So if the church has at least 2 or 3 computers, let's start to build on that. Now, the necessary condition for that to be sustainable also means we need to increase the robustness of policing and protection of those resources, because we are aware of the fact that in communities where there is I don't want to say a deficit of resources, but in communities that have been excluded, right, it's hard to bring in resources without the desire for people to get their hands on them. So we need to be aware of those conditions, because they're built into the system that we've created, by the way. We can't look at community members and say, yeah, we'd like to help, but you guys just always like to steal the stuff. It doesn't help to do that, right? Because the reason why that exists is because you guys did not give us the resources in the first place. So I think there are 3 main things here, right? To say, 1, there's a modeling framework that we can start to use to galvanize our social public infrastructure that exists, that we can look from the IEC and use. Then 2, we need to start resourcing, capacitating those institution infrastructure, social infrastructure for young people and people, even old people, even our moms that want to figure out how to use a smartphone or whatever. Start to then capacitate them with, for example, internet. There's a thing called SA Connect that the Department of Communications and Telecoms has, where it's basically, I want to say like a free zone where you can get internet connection through SA Connect, right? Put that it exists in public libraries, in your post office, in some public hospitals and clinics. Put that in the churches as well. Let people come there, do their schoolwork, learn how to engage with digital media through public infrastructure that already exists, right? Then after that, we need to get a serious kind of internal desire to sustain this one, but also enforceable policing that's going to make sure that we can keep these resources there and that they can continue to grow, and that we can also say to people, invest in this little community because your resources are safe here.
So viewers back at home, thank you so much for watching, but let's continue chatting, shall we? I did say that the hashtag to use is Y20 South Africa, hashtag CNBC Corporate Breakfast, at CNBC Africa is where you can find the channel across all social media platforms, and of course, at Balesa_Fox is where you will find me. Thank you for joining.